Today, I'm going to be showing you why freehand knife edge angle guides may actually be hurting your sharpening performance rather than helping it. And if you've ever wondered why you could get a knife paper cutting sharp but never shaving sharp, this may also help answer that question. So it is paper cutting sharp, but it is not even close to shaving. Edge angle guides work pretty simply. You simply place them onto the stone, you take your knife, you set them on the stone, and that's your sharpening angle that you need to maintain throughout the sharpening process. The problem is that these knife edge angle guides are simply not accurate for the vast majority of knives, and they can actually be over angling your knife into the stone, causing you to lose sharpening performance rather than gaining it. So let's take a look at how these edge angle guides actually measure the angle and why they don't work with the vast majority of knives. So what do these numbers on these angle guides actually mean? Well, the reality is that they actually mean nothing. At least in terms of what angle is actually on your knife. Because the angles that are mentioned on the angle guide are actually in reference to the knife center line. So here is the stone, and the angle is measured in reference from the stone to the center line of the knife. So if we draw a line from the knife spine all the way down to the very apex and extend that line out past the spine, this is your angle from the center line of the knife to the sharpening surface or the sharpening stone. So first off, we have a chef's knife. This knife has zero taper from the spine to the actual edge of the knife, or the behind the edge thickness. It's the same thickness all the way through from the spine to the edge. And when we place this knife on our 14-degree angle, our actual angle is around the 14-degree mark, as it should be. And that is because we have zero taper between the spine and the actual apex of the knife. Problem is that the vast majority of knives are not designed like this. This knife actually has a taper from the spine to the apex. So when we place this knife on our 14-degree angle, we need to place this on the flat portion of the flats of the knife to give us a true angle of what we're actually sharpening at. And that angle is going to be around 16 to 17 degrees. 16 to 17 degrees is not 14 degrees as indicated on our angle guide. Now the numbers here on these angle guides are actually in reference from the stone to the exact center line of the knife. So right down the middle of the knife. Now this means that the way that your knife is ground, or literally the knife design, the knife blade design itself, will actually dictate what angle you're sharpening your knife at. And we start to run into problems when we get into different types of knife grind. So here we have the 14-degree side. Place our angle finder on the flat portion of the knife. That'll represent the center line of the knife. And even though we're setting the knife on the 14-degree angle, we're looking at almost 22 degrees actual angle that we're sharpening at. Now you may be asking, why is this a problem? The problem is that the vast majority of beginning knife sharpeners will see this 14-degree angle here and think it's only reserved for something like very thin, delicate chef's knives. And they may say, well, I have a hard use folder. I need to use the 25-degree angle or the 20-degree angle. So they pick their 25-degree angle, they set it on the stone, they put their knife on there, and they try to sharpen away, and they get paper cutting sharp, but they don't get shaving sharp, and here's why. Let's get our angle finder again. We'll put our angle finder on the flat portion of the knife. Now all of a sudden we're approaching 30 degrees on this knife, which is way too obtuse of an angle on that apex. We flatten this apex out way too much at 30 degrees for it to be as sharp as it otherwise could be, which is why you can cut paper, but you can't shave with it. Knife edges, very sharp knife edges, they need to be pointy. Obtuse angles are not sharp. 30-degree angles are not sharp. That 14-degree range to 20-degree range is where you want to be, not 30 degrees. 30 degrees will not get you a very sharp knife. Now I wanted to see, can I even get a knife sharp using the 25-degree angle, using a knife with a little bit of spine thickness? And this isn't anything crazy. This is a Endura 4, so it's not even anything crazy. I think we're going to dull it more than sharpen it. So the 25-degree angle on this angle guide here is extreme. I mean, this felt unnatural. It felt like I was trying to cut into the stone, not try to sharpen my knife. It is not very sharp. There's a burr on there, but I don't even think, this isn't even possible. At 25 degrees, we're so angled into the knife, our apex is like this. So here's the 25 degree indicated apex. So this is actually probably closer to 27 degrees, counting the spine thickness, somewhere in that range between 25 and 31, 32 degrees. This is a very obtuse angle. It's so wedge shaped that it will cut paper, but it will not shave. No matter how much I strop this thing, it just will not shave arm hair, but it will sort of cut paper. So it is paper cutting sharp, but it is not even close to shaving. Now, I think the single biggest mistake that most beginner freehand sharpeners make is they are not sharpening at steep enough of an angle. You need to lay that geometry down and get a pointier edge on your knife for it to become as sharp as possible. I think a lot of people are too fearful to go too steep because it could potentially cause edge chipping issues or rolling issues. Now, I think that this fear of going too steep is what's keeping most people from getting the sharpest knife possible. And I think the vast majority of people who are experiencing edge rolling or chipping issues are not actually dealing with the knife apex. They're actually dealing with a failure to correctly remove the burr. Let me show you. So let's see what that looks like. We raise a very small burr along the apex right off of the stone. And this knife feels sharp. It cuts paper just fine and blazes through cardboard just fine as well. The knife feels very sharp. But when we look at it under the microscope, we see a microscopic burr along the apex. This burr is too small to see with the naked eye and very difficult to feel unless you really know what to feel for. So when cutting stuff, the knife does just fine until we cut something that stresses the apex a little bit more, like this piece of wood. All of a sudden, we start to run into problems, and now, when running your fingernail along the apex, it feels like there's small chipping going on. So let's see what that looks like now. And what do you know? Our burr has been absolutely shredded to pieces from the wood, simulating what feels like microchipping in this ZDP 189 blade, when in reality the burr has been the problem the whole time, not the edge angle, the steel, or the heat treatment. Now let's do the same test with a properly deburred knife. So we go back, properly sharpen and deburr this knife, using alternating light over passes on the stone, and we hit it on a 30 micron and 6 micron strops for a nice 14 degrees per side, coarse grit, burr-free apex. And here you can see our nice crisp burr-free apex in comparison with our apex that still had the microscopic burr. We do the exact same thing we did before. We cut some cardboard, we whittle some wood, we try to force that apex over into a chippy mode, and that's about as much as we did last time. That was probably over what we did. And I don't feel any chipping. And this is the exact spot where we were trying to force that apex to roll over and break off into the wood, and you can see it looks exactly the same as when we started. And in contrast, here's the chippy burr apex. Now, let's say that you do end up going a little bit too steep on your angle, and you decide to sharpen a 55 HRC chef's knife at 14 degrees per side and use it to whittle a 2x4. You may end up seeing some actual edge damage from hard use scenarios if you're using a relatively soft, cheap steel to do hard use cutting tasks at very steep edge angles. And here's what that looks like. A $1 stainless steel knife at 55 HRC is simply not tough enough to hold that very steep edge angle. And you may start to see some actual apex damage. Well, the solution is to add a very small amount of angle to that edge geometry. So if you sharpened at 14 degrees per side, raise that edge angle up as tiny amount as you can. I've done a lot of experimentation on this when trying to figure out my own bevel geometries for the knives that I make here in the workshop, and I've discovered that even a half a degree per side, which is less than you can actually compensate for freehand. I actually have a hard time doing it on my 2x72 grinder with a grinding jig. I have trouble getting that half a degree, but even half a degree per side can make a difference between an edge that rolls over or an edge that's chippy and one that is perfectly stable. So I resharpen the knife at a hair over 14 degrees per side. We will say somewhere between 14 and 17 because adding exactly 1 degree freehand is basically impossible. It's such a small adjustment. And we repeat the same test. Now here is the completely deburred $1 knife apex. And by the way, a general rule of thumb is the cheaper and softer the steel, the harder it is to completely remove the burr. I actually spent quite some time attempting to completely deburr this knife, and you can still see very small pieces of the burr just hanging onto the apex. And we repeat the same test by cutting the same amount of cardboard and whittling a 2x6. I mean, on the same spot, we are still absolutely hair-popping sharp. And here is that exact spot up close under the microscope, and it looks, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same. Now, when I say adding the tiniest amount of angle to the knife apex can stabilize it, I actually mean that. Sometimes even putting a little bit more pressure onto a strop when stropping will round over that apex just enough to stabilize that apex and keep you from having rolled edges or chippy edges. It's literally that sensitive. Now, I think the problem here is that all of this sounds fairly complicated because as a beginner, you may be sitting there thinking, well, if these don't work, how exactly do I know what angle to hold as I'm using my sharpening stone? Well, the problem is that I can't really answer that question because it depends. It depends on the steel your knife is made of, it depends on the heat treatment, and it also depends on exactly what you're cutting. All of this stuff changes depending on all of the variables involved in what is causing your knife to chip or roll in the first place. Are you running your knife into staples every day? Are you simply just cutting cardboard? Are you cutting carpet? Again, it depends. All of this will play a role in how that knife apex performs when cutting. But what I can do is I can give you a pretty good range to start from. And I'm going to go ahead and say that these things aren't all bad. These things are actually a pretty good reference point if you know how to interpret the numbers that are imprinted on the angle guide. My recommendation is to use the 14-degree angle or somewhere around that range. Not all of these are 14 degrees. Most of them are. You can get the little ones with individual angles, but somewhere around the 14-degree mark is going to be a pretty close guess, depending on the spine thickness of your knife, as a good starting point. If you have a zero taper from your knife spine to the knife apex, then that's going to give you an accurate 14 degrees. If your knife has a little bit more spine thickness and a slightly different grind, you're going to have to compensate for that. But 14 degrees will get you in a pretty good range. You may have to drop that angle ever so slightly, or set your knife on here, pull the angle out, and then drop the spine ever so slightly to give you a slightly steeper angle to get you in that, we'll say 17-degree range is a good number to shoot for. And I found that very few knives, I don't think I have a single knife in my shop that is not incapable of holding a good 17-degree edge angle if it's properly deburred, including a $1 kitchen knife from the dollar store.
Thou must be able to hold a 17-degree per side edge.
Now, as I was editing this, Pete over at Cedric and Ada dropped a video about how his H1 steel from Spyderco was having trouble holding a 17-degree edge. And that reminded me, I also have a Spyderco Salt in H1 steel. Probably the worst steel to ever be made. It's that bad. And yes, this does have trouble holding very steep edges. This has trouble holding any edge, let's be honest. This is why I say it depends on the steel type, the hardness level, and exactly what you're doing with the knife. But a good rule of thumb is to start low, see if you notice any edge damage doing your cutting tasks, and then add angle as you see fit. I hope I explained it well. For some reason, I had a really difficult time with this video because there's so many things to discuss. There's so many variables involved in knife performance and things that you're cutting and so on and so forth. Steels, heat treatments, hardness levels, that I think I just had to simplify it as much as possible. And we can really dive into the weeds here on this subject and really get into this. It's a lot more complicated than it may seem on the surface, but don't let that scare you. Just get an angle guide, park it at 14 degrees, and sharpen away and see how your knife performs. Make adjustments from there. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.